Hi, I'm Johnny from UltimatePaperMache.com, and this week I made this little fiber cement lamb. I had two reasons for making this guy. The first one is that I made a little boy. It's a little farmer boy that I made him last month, I think it was, and he just looked a little bit lonely, so I thought he needed a friend, and a lamb seemed appropriate. The other reason is that I saw some cement sheep out online. I'll give you a link to them. And I really liked them. The simplicity was really nice. Basically, no detail, just the shape and the colors of the black-faced lamb, which is really impressive. I didn't want to totally steal their idea or reproduce their sculpture entirely, because that would have been kind of rude, but I just really liked the idea, so I tried to get as close as I could. I did a few things that are experimental on this fellow. I'm using a product called Quick Wall. It's a surface bonding cement. I happen to have some on hand. I didn't want to go to the store and buy anything to make this fellow, and I'm relying almost exclusively on the fibers in the Quick Wall product to keep it from cracking. I didn't use any, well, I used very little reinforcing on the surface of this armature. I did use a little bit on the legs, very light wire, a little bit on the body using aluminum mesh, which most ferrocement people say don't do it because it expands and contracts at a different rate than the cement. So if you really want a museum piece that's going to last for hundreds of years, go to the library, get a book on ferrocement, and use their ideas instead. This was a quick and easy way to make a garden sculpture. I don't know how long it will last. It should last, I don't know, plenty long enough for me. I'm trying to think what else I should say. One thing I do want to mention, I did use Quick Wall product, which is made by Quikrete. It's available here at my local Lowe's and other hardware stores in this area, but there are a lot of places in the United States, and I'm sure all over the world, where you can't buy it. I don't know why they don't distribute it everywhere, but they don't. So I'm going to leave a link down below this video for a site that will give you recipes for a fiberglass reinforced mortar. It's the second recipe on that page, and so if you want to do this but you can't get a hold of Quick Wall, go ahead and use Andrew Goss's recipe instead. Now let me show you how I made this fellow. This lamb was made almost exactly the same way that I would make a lamb if I was using the papier-mâché clay, and for that reason I started out with a pattern just like I always do. I looked at a whole lot of photographs of lambs on Google Images and drew one out. If you want to make a papier-mâché lamb instead of using the cement, you could go ahead and use the same pattern and create a cardboard pattern to go on the inside of your papier-mâché sculpture, the same way that I did in my book, Make Animal Sculptures with Papier-Mâché Clay. On a fairly large sculpture like this, the cardboard pattern would actually be just a little bit easier, but you could use the wire armature as well, just like we do for the little dog. So you can do it either way. And if you want to use my pattern, you can download it from my website at ultimatepapermache.com. I'll put a link to it down below. If you're one of the folks that is still pretty much convinced that you can just use some spar varnish on your papier-mâché sculpture and that will protect it outside, be sure to see Michelle's guest post that went up, I think it was last week, on my website. I'll put a link to it down below. She shows you how she made a beautiful giraffe, all of the details on how it was made, and then she also shows you what happened the first time it rained, which was very sad. So be sure and see it. I highly recommend that if you want to make a sculpture to go outside, use some form of cement or resin or something else that's actually made for outdoor sculptures. The first thing I had to do once I had the pattern was to make it a whole lot bigger. It's only about 7 inches wide on the piece of paper, and I needed it to be about 13 inches high at the shoulders. So I'm using a 1.5 inch square. I just made a whole lot of squares on that piece of poster board and then started to draw each individual square on the grid. Using the grid makes it really, really easy to reproduce a drawing. Some people even use it for making portraits, and it really does work. I didn't want to confuse myself too much with which lines were for what, so I made the wire line out of purple and the outside line out of green. I had some of the fence stays left over from the little boy. I think it's about a 9-gauge wire, but I'm not really sure. I got it at the farm store, and it's fairly easy to bend, so it worked really well. I used some tie wire to put the pieces together at the spots that are marked there on the pattern, and that turned it into a pretty solid armature, really. It was kind of surprising how stiff it was. And then I used the aluminum foil very tightly wound to stiffen it even more and to give those legs a little bit more shape. I'm going to be using a fiber reinforced mortar, but I also want to reinforce it just a little bit. I'm using this really fine wire. I wrapped it around the aluminum foil. This is going to help the mortar stick to the legs, and hopefully will also offer the mortar just a little bit of reinforcing in case the legs get stressed in any way when it's moved around. Then I laid my armature back down over the pattern, and I started using some of this bubble wrap and whatever those things are called, those little pillow things. The only reason I'm using this to fill out the form of the body and the head is just because I'm cleaning out my garage, and that's what I happen to have. I thought it was going to be a whole lot harder to use than it ended up being, and now I'm kind of convinced that if I ever did a really big sculpture, I would go to some store that gets a lot of this and has to throw it all away, because it ended up with a really, really light armature, and it was not as difficult to use as I thought it was going to be. I did cover it up with the plastic tape just to protect it, try to keep the wires from breaking all those little bubbles. I used some aluminum mesh wrapped around the body and the head and the tail. This is being used to keep the just basically to give the mortar something to hold on to. I did wrap some more of the galvanized steel wire around the mesh just to hold it on and to give just a little bit more reinforcing to the cement. But I'm really not using very much reinforcing. I'm depending almost entirely on the fibers in the quick wall mortar. I have seen some articles by people who have made garden sculptures using the quick wall and without very much reinforcing or any reinforcing at all. But like I said before, we don't know how long this is going to last, so consider it experimental. And then the last thing I did was to make him two ears, but they're attached to each other. There's a strip that goes all the way around the back of his head. This was made with some heavy steel wire and some aluminum mesh and some very light wire kind of holding everything together, and it was wired onto the armature. The cement mortar will go all the way through that strip at the back, and hopefully it will hold it on very firmly to the back of his head. I don't want his ears coming off if I happen to bang him up against the fence post or something. And now I get to start putting the actual cement on the sculpture. The quick wall is just mixed either with just plain water or with water that's mixed half and half with acrylic fortifier. I use the acrylic fortifier because it does make it stronger and it makes it more waterproof, so I went ahead and did that. It's kind of expensive. The quick wall, as I hope I said at the beginning of the video, is not available everywhere, so if you can't find it, there's a link down below this video that will show you a recipe. It would be the second recipe on the page that I'm linking to. Andrew Goss developed recipes for fiber reinforced mortars that work really well. I did the underside first because that was a whole lot easier to reach if he was laying on his back. Then I did the legs, and as you can see here, I'm being really civilized and using a knife, but I got tired of that really fast and just started picking up the cement with my hands and smishing it really hard through those holes. I could have added the mortar to the ears at that point, but I ran out and I didn't want to make just such a small little batch, so I'll do that a little bit later. At this point I put a plastic bag over him and let him cure overnight. The next morning I mixed up some charcoal colored Quick-Wall, just using the charcoal pigment specially made for cement, and you find that in the same area of your hardware store that all the other cement products are sold. Now if you leave your first layer a little bit long and it's actually dried out, you'll want to mist it before you apply the second coat, because otherwise the dry cement would pull the water out of the new layer and it would dry out too quickly. As you'll see in a few seconds, I did some more work on those ears, which required a second layer of the charcoal color. That's just because I wanted to reinforce the ears really well. I used the charcoal for the face and the ears and the legs, of course. The next morning I mixed up a really small batch of anchoring cement. You get that at the same place that you get all the other concrete stuff. It's supposed to be used to anchor bolts and things in concrete. But I did read in a book called Creating Concrete Art Furniture that it's really good for reinforcing really narrow edges, like the ears on the lamb. It's stronger than ordinary cement, he says, and it will help protect those thin edges. It gets hard really fast, so you can only mix up just a very small amount at a time. Now while that anchoring cement is getting hard, I went ahead and mixed up some more white Quick-Wall. I'm still using the acrylic fortifier in the water, of course, like I have for the whole project. And I'm putting it on fairly thick. I'm using it for the wool on the white parts of the lamb. After all the white parts were done, I went back and put another layer of the charcoal colored over all the dark parts and thickened up the legs and covered up that anchoring cement on the ears. So now really all that's necessary to finish him up is to clean off all the little dark parts that ended up in his white parts where they didn't belong. And I put a plastic bag over him and left him overnight. In the morning the cement was still soft enough so I could smooth off those legs just a little bit with sandpaper. I didn't want to smooth off the white parts because I needed them to be kind of woolly, but the legs were just a little bit rougher than I wanted. Now because I used that acrylic additive, it shouldn't need to be damp cured any longer than it already was just by leaving it in the plastic bag. That's one of the reasons why it's kind of fun to use that stuff, even though it is kind of expensive. And this is how he looks now that he's out with his friend, the little farmer boy. I think he looks okay. It's a very simple project. There's no detail on the lamb, and it went pretty fast, but I think it actually adds something to the flower border. I'm very happy with him. So that's it for today. Be sure and come visit me, ultimatepapermache.com. I'd love to see you there.